All right. So, Diane, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today about your book. I'll hold it up, Companions in the Darkness. It's a wonderful book. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's so good to be with you.
Yeah, it is. It's good to talk about such things. Um, in your book, you discuss how depression affects our spiritual lives. And so this disease affects everybody, really, Christians alike. So maybe you could start by just discussing that for a moment.
Sure. Yeah, I know some people would say that faithful Christians won't get depressed, but I think you don't have to look much further than the stories in this book to know that that's not the case. We struggle from mental illnesses just like we struggle from physical illnesses. And it's not a reflection of our faithfulness or our faith. It just means that sometimes these things happen. But as you were saying about the effects it has on our spiritual life, from my own experience and that of the people whose stories I tell in Companions in the Darkness, um, depression does have an impact on the spiritual life. And I think I've learned that it has more to do with how we perceive things or how we feel things, just like is true with the way that depression affects the way that we feel or perceive relationships with friends or family members or our work or our hobbies. Anyone who suffers from depression will tell you it's more than just sadness, right? We've all
Mm.
experienced sadness, and we can find things that distract us or areas of life that that sadness may not touch. But that's not the case with depression. Depression reaches its fingers into everything. And so it's not just sadness, it's also, it affects our sense of worth, our ability to connect with people, our sense of motivation. And if that's true with things and people that we can physically engage with or audibly hear, I think it shouldn't come as a surprise that that happens in our relationship with God as well. So, what that looks like, I think sometimes the spiritual disciplines feel different than they normally do. Um, Charles Spurgeon once said that scripture, when he was depressed, instead of being a source of comfort, just lifted his sense of woe. Mother Teresa once said that she just felt like she couldn't pray. And I think if people like that, who we consider to be giants and so faithful and leaving such a profound legacy, if they can feel those things, I can feel those things too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say I can feel those things. In the book, you're very transparent that you've experienced some of the things, and it's always, I don't want to say a delight, but I find it comforting that people are willing to share so that they can help others. So I guess I just want to thank you for sharing that piece of your life in the book as well.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. It's helpful to people when we're discussing such things to know that you understand,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so the book is made up of seven saints that you write about, and seven. I don't know if I'd say short stories. They are entertaining and not just factual based. So it does. You get to spend a day in the life of each of these individuals, or weeks maybe. Um, and it was very interesting how much detail you put into the research. Um, you do a lot of historical documents. You do letters that they write to their friends that their friends wrote to them. A couple of these, I've read volumes on, and I still was like, I didn't know that about them. So that was pretty. You can tell you put a lot of research into it. I guess is the bottom line here. Perhaps you could share a couple tidbits of autobiographical information on maybe one or two of them that might have been pieces that when you hit that piece of research, you went, wow, or aha, those kind of moments, or at least that you found interesting.
Yeah. So I'll start with William Cooper just because he was, I think, the one out of the seven that I found to be the most interesting or I connected with the most. His story is a very sad one. I think it might be the saddest one in the book just because of how deep and long lasting his depression was. But I think what surprised me doing research about him was, in spite of this depression that lingered and this sense that he had for most of his life that God had just abandoned him. He was such a warm person. And I guess it surprised me how much I was drawn to him in spite of how dark his own story was. He had a whole collection of pet animals, including a few tame rabbits that lived in his house. He loved walking. He would write little poems to some of his friends, thanking them for gifts or things like that. And so I think with a story like his, seeing this warm, very even sometimes humorous person emerge out of reading his letters was a surprise and a delight. I couldn't quite get enough of him. And he was good friends with John Newton. So people might know John Newton. He wrote Amazing Grace. And John Newton actually encouraged William Cowper to write hymns as well. So the one that people may recognize is There Is a Fountain Filled with Blood. I think that's the one that I'm most familiar with of his hymns. So he left that treasure for us. Another person that I found to be interesting was Martin Luther King Jr. I had never heard of his depression before researching him for this book. So it was interesting to piece together accounts from friends and colleagues and aides and start to see this picture emerge of a depression that appeared episodically throughout his life, and particularly at the end of his life, the last year and a half of his life. And just be able to piece some of that together. I don't think, because of his context and the role he played in the civil rights movement, and I don't feel like he had the freedom to share about his struggle publicly. Mm-hmm. And so it was really interesting to have a clearer picture develop of his private life and some of his vulnerabilities there. One thing that I definitely had not heard about him before was that twice when he was a young man, a teenager, preteen, he tried to take his own life, and that was surprising to hear. And again, why do we not hear those kinds of stories? And yeah, so it was good to have him become a little more three-dimensional in my mind's eye.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even Paul in the Bible, struggles with that same concept, right? So yeah. It's not something that's a stranger to people.
Yeah.
And that being said, in your book, you do point out also not just, that they suffer from the malady of depression, but you share how they use different methods and techniques to deal with their depression. Although they might not have called it depression, with Martin Luther, you were just the 99 Theses, Martin Luther. I forgot the German word, but he called it something different.
Anfechtung.
That's the word.
Yeah.
So, but they would share with friends or with colleagues about their depression or how to help someone else that was struggling and how they kept their faith and their spirituality. And I think that's awesome that now you're sharing it with the public in this volume as well. Perhaps you could share with us like one of the methods that one of these men and women used to deal with their depression.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I feel like I've learned so much from them, and having walked through depression myself, their stories and their wisdom are something I need, so it's been a joy to learn from them and put some of these things into practice. So since you mentioned him, Martin Luther, we'll start with him. His advice about depression was to flee solitude. Depression makes you want to withdraw. And he understood that was one of the worst things that you could do, because when you're alone, it gives time for your thoughts to fester. And I think if you've been depressed, or even if you haven't been, but you're not really in a great mental space, when you're alone and you're just listening to the voices in your head, you can see how they slowly start to unravel and spiral down. And so he would say, don't be alone. Don't be alone. I know that that's really a challenge in the pandemic with those of us who are struggling with our mental health. So I've been thinking a lot about, he once said, if you can't not be alone by going to be with friends, he would go out and be with his pigs.
Hmm.
So
I like it.
anything to pull himself out of his own mind. So thinking about that in terms of where we are right now, okay, so I might not be able to go visit a friend or go out and get coffee, but what are different or creative ways that I can get out of that cycling mental space? Along with that, he would tell people, so flee solitude and go be with your friends and find some way to try to engage in some of those tangible physical pleasures of God's good earth. So something that will make you laugh, something that will bring just the littlest glimmer of delight. And again, when you're depressed, that's easier said than done. I think sometimes it's more just going through the motions, maybe putting your body in the position that maybe sometimes delight might surprise you, or that you're there ready for it when it comes. So it's not always easy advice to follow. I know that. Luther knew that. But I think it's good advice, to not to resist some of that draw that depression has to keep you alone, and to continue to keep you from some of the little glimmers of delight that might come. And like I said, he understood that. I mean, he spent months sequestered away in Wartburg Castle for his own safety, but he was alone and he missed his friends, and he was battling some of those. I mean, we now say metaphorically, but he would say literally demons in his mind. And so I think that advice that he had to offer comes out of his own experience, and it's hard won, but I think it holds.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And you're right, it's hard. I mean, the classical definition of one of the signs of depression is you see people pushing everyone away and
Yeah.
withdrawing.
Yeah.
And it's painful to talk to people when you're in that situation. But yeah, you have to get out of your head, as you say, and be around others so that you can be reminded that you're loved and that people care about you. And just to not think about what you're thinking.
Yeah. And for me, sometimes it's not even, okay, I'm going to go have a conversation. But I can remember a couple times in college, I would say to my friends, I just need to come sit in your apartment. And we didn't really talk. They were working on homework. I was trying to, but couldn't really concentrate. But I was at least there with other people who were living and breathing and warm, and I knew cared about me. And that made a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So my final question for you, and I know that you address it a lot in the back of the book. You have an appendix that goes through how to help others and how to help yourselves in this situation. But maybe you could share one or 2 points now with the listeners on how to help yourself, or if you're seeing someone else suffering, how would a Christian go about dealing with that? I mean, sometimes that's a tricky thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we have a lot of examples of ways that it's not been done well. So,
Correct.
and so I think sometimes people feel overwhelmed because they know, I don't want to do it poorly. So what do I do? Right. So for someone, I think, who's trying to care for a loved one or a friend who's depressed, I would say the first thing is to try to help them get treatment. So trying to remove some of those barriers for them being able to get help. So whether that's helping them to find a counselor, encouraging them to make an appointment with their primary care doctor. If you're in the position where maybe you help them remember to take their medication or talk through any misgivings they might have about something like that. So that's the first step, I think, is helping someone get the professional care that they need. But that doesn't mean that our job is over. And that's where the day in, day out, trying to support them while they're walking through trying to recover from depression. And that's where the hard work is, I think. So another thing I would say is don't try to do that alone. I think sometimes we get into this, and maybe this is just my personality, right? Sometimes we get into this Messiah complex where we think I will be the one to save this person, or I have to be able to be strong enough to do it on my own, or whatever. But it's not a journey you need to walk alone. And I think it's better to think about it more in a team mindset. So are there other loved ones, professionals, friends that you can pull into this relationship to help this person who's struggling with depression kind of build the support network around them? And around yourself. I mean, if you're living with a spouse or a child that's suffering from depression, you might want to think about going to see a counselor yourself to process that experience and make sure that you're taking care of yourself. You're not going to do anybody any good by burning out or harming your own mental health. And finally, I'd say be patient. It's a long process, and sometimes it kind of comes in fits and starts, that recovery from depression. And so don't expect it to just go away, with the flip of your fingers, and try to remember that you're going to have to be in it for the long haul. Um, if you're suffering from depression, I would say again, don't be afraid to get help, the help that you need. There's no shame in that. It is not a poor reflection on your character or your faith or God's ability to use you. And we need you. So try to get the help that you need. Um, and, and I would say too, just know that you're not alone in this, right? There are other people who have walked through this throughout history. That's why I wrote this book, so we can have that comfort. And I guarantee you there are other people around you today that have walked through this as well. You're not alone. This is not the end. And there is the God that we follow, the God that we worship, is one who keeps company with us in the dark. He has not left you. And I think that kind of foundational truth, that you're not alone, that there are others who have walked this way, and that God is with us, I think that provides us with the seeds of hope to keep pressing on and keep choosing life and keep going forward.
Absolutely. In that same vein, I'd like to point out that, you know, people that are depressed do need people. And even if you're not truly close to someone, if it's someone in your church and you can tell that they're suffering, a lot of people are afraid, but at least engage them. Just being seen makes a difference to a lot of people. It could make the difference between life and death. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
be compassionate to one another, even if you're not depressed. So, the other comment I'd like to make, on edgeoffaithmagazine.com, we do have an icon that's on the bottom right-hand corner of our webpage that's for Christian counseling. So if you're watching the video and you do need counseling, you can just click that button, put in the region you live in, and it'll give you a whole list of counselors that are Christian counselors that can work with you. So Diana, thank you again for writing the book and for all the research you put into it, and for sharing with us today some of the pieces of it. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show.